truth is the most convincing story that maps onto reality, and that's why the central narrative is falling apart.
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
We must see the central narrative for the fiction that it is. We are Americans.
While elections are sometimes messy, this was a secure election.
The founders began the fight for human liberty and self-governance, and it's up to us to finish the job.
I'll tell you what, we are in a truth emergency right now.
This is the end game.
It's Tuesday, October 1st, 2024, the 1,350th day of dystopia. I'm your moderator, Chris Paul. Let's be reasonable. A warm welcome and hello to all of you listening to the podcast through a paid subscription at I'mYourModerator.substack.com. You can become a paid subscriber for as little as $50 a year or $5 a month. And in doing so, you will get the ad-free experience. You'll be able to participate in the conversation over on Substack. And you'll be invited to the interactive live stream every Wednesday afternoon. And if you can't, or you simply don't want to, continue listening to the free version on Substack, a wide variety of podcast platforms, and of course, Rumble. All I ask is that you share it with your friends. You can find the links to the podcast, the writing, the social media, and the merch site by visiting linktree.com. Anyone who understands the roller coaster we've been on these past few years knows we haven't reached the end yet, and there may still be hard times to come. And as we add $1 trillion to the national debt every 100 days, we could be headed for some shaky financial times. If you're like me, you're figuring out how to diversify and make sure some seeds are planted for whatever may come. And that's one of the many reasons I think Bitcoin is part of our future. But it's not only about money. Bitcoin looks to be a critical part of the next generation of technology, communications, energy, verification, and even national defense. I'd encourage everyone to do their research and do it now. And if you're convinced of the likelihood that Bitcoin is an essential part of our future, then you'll need an on-ramp. I recommend River. River empowers you to grow your portfolio without any unwanted surprises and eliminates third-party custodians, putting you in control of your assets. Open an account with no minimum purchase requirement. You can get your Bitcoin journey started with just $1. Visit partner.river.com/reasonable to create your River account today. That's partner.river.com/reasonable. Now, I know that many of you out there understand the need to diversify assets, or maybe you're looking to protect your retirement savings, but you're not quite there yet on Bitcoin. And you feel better about precious metals? I get that too. I think going in multiple directions is wise, and I do that myself. And when it comes to buying precious metals, you want to be working with a good company. And that's why I've partnered with Goldco. Goldco is a 6-time Inc. 5000 winner, 2022 Company of the Year, and they've helped people like you and me place over $2 billion in gold and silver. And I have gotten silver from Goldco. And right now they're offering my supporters up to $10,000 in bonus silver while supplies last. Don't pass this offer up. Go to reasonablegold.com now. This is your opportunity to protect you and your family from an out-of-control government before it's too late. So don't wait a second longer. Take action today. Click on the link in the podcast notes or go to reasonablegold.com now and get your free gold kit, your free IRA kit. You'll be glad you did. All right, so a couple things before we get into what I want to talk about today. One, an amusing addition to what we were discussing yesterday regarding all the election integrity stuff. This is from Breitbart. Gavin Newsom signs bill barring local authorities from requiring voter ID. Now, you might have heard me tell this story on here before. I think I've mentioned it once or twice. I talked about it with my friend Patrick Gunnels on our show Hindsight 2020 a couple of weeks back. But in 2020, when I went to vote, rather than a local small precinct, a school cafeteria, or gymnasium, I went to a voting center, this one being held at the Hollywood Bowl. Rather than walking down the block to vote with my neighbors, I had to drive 10 or 15 minutes and then park and then walk and not recognize anyone. Obviously, by then, I knew that California's voting system was rigged beyond repair, and as someone who was about to vote for Trump and someone who'd already been censored and banned by big tech platforms, I felt like there was a strong chance that my vote was not going to count. Now, of course, I received a mail-in ballot in the mail, as everyone did. In fact, the reason I got banned from Instagram was that I talked on camera about how the Secretary of State's office had changed my voter registration to permanent mail-in only without my permission. So I had my mail-in ballot. I had it in hand. I took it to the polling place and I said, "Do you need this? This is my mail-in ballot." And she said, "Sure, we'll take that for you." And I said, "You know what? I'm going to pass on that." I ripped it in half. I threw it in the trash and I took out my ID. And the lady at the table said, "Oh, no, sir, we can't take that." I said, "You can't take my ID?" She said, "No, you're not allowed to show us that. We can't take those from anyone." And I thought, what would happen? You didn't even ask me for it, but you can't look at it. You don't want to see it. You don't think you should be seeing it. Oh, you just can't see it because the people watching over you would report that. You can't have poll workers checking IDs in California, or else it wouldn't be a blue state anymore. The normie has now reached the point where they will say openly, "Communism is coming to America. We can't let it in." Well, hey, normies, it's been communist for a long time, decades. California is a straight-up communist dystopia. If the land didn't look the way it does and the people didn't look the way they do, no one would ever doubt that. But of course, it's beautiful there, and the people are beautiful, and the weather is amazing, and you can do anything you want, and it's all very glamorous. And if you have the money to live there and have access to all that stuff, it's really easy to think there's no way this is communism. In fact, this is the crown jewel of a free market society. But of course, that's impossible because they don't let you vote. Why would a place bother with free markets if they didn't even have free elections? It's not possible to produce a deep blue state without stolen elections. You steal a few elections in a row and then the people just assume that's really who they are. And that's not the sort of thing that you can take away from elections if no one can even know who the voters are. But let's get into this article. California Governor Gavin Newsom signed a bill Sunday that will bar local authorities from requiring photo ID to vote, which exceeds the state's requirements. California is one of 14 Democrat-run states that do not require any ID to vote, despite requiring it for many other purposes. Voters at polling places are checked off against voter rolls without further proof being required. Voters who submit mail-in ballots must include their signatures on the envelopes that are checked by a machine against the signatures on file in the voter registration records. And how convenient is that for all of those voters, quote unquote, who are automatically registered at the DMV and their signature at the DMV goes right into their voter registration file. And of course, that quote unquote voter is never going to quote unquote vote. So you can really just print the ballot, mark the ballot with the signature on file, and then enter the ballot into the count. And of course, the signature is going to match the signature on file because it's the same one. This isn't a system that makes mistakes. This isn't a product of human error. These aren't people exploiting holes in the system. This is a system being set up with the express intent of controlling elections from start to finish, every single aspect. The city of Huntington Beach, one of the last conservative bastions in the state, which often opposes Democrat policies, planned to require photo ID for voting in 2024 after a ballot initiative passed to that effect in March. The new law, SB 1174, quote, would prohibit a local government from enacting or enforcing any charter provision, ordinance, or regulation requiring a person to present identification for the purpose of voting or submitting a ballot at any polling place, vote center, or other location where ballots are cast or submitted as specified. So they're not allowed to ask you for ID, and if they don't like that policy, they're also not allowed to change it because the state says so. And isn't that something? All they need is enough voter registrations they can control, in any municipality or county or school district or whatever, and within a few cycles they'll have completely taken over. The Democrat, Republican, red, blue, right, left distinction is irrelevant. The uniparty takes over the election system, and then they just run whatever narrative needs to be run in a given place to achieve the illusion of legitimacy, supporting whatever outcome they deemed necessary. The text of the law also claims, without evidence, voter identification laws have historically been used to disenfranchise low-income voters, voters of color, voters with disabilities, and senior voters. And that is a claim without evidence. That is only a claim backed up by the fact that it has been claimed so many times before. You might call it a big lie. Politico reported on the new law and another that bans local authorities from prohibiting vote counting machines. The legislation from Senator Dave Min, an Orange County Democrat running for Representative Katie Porter's open house seat, is a direct response to a controversial ballot measure approved this year by voters in Huntington Beach, requiring people to show photo identification at the polls. It will take effect on January 1st. It almost sounds like he's concerned about his own election there, like he's depending on the votes of people with no ID. Legislation from Senator Steve Bradford, signed into law Wednesday, clarifies record-keeping procedures for secure elections data and increases the Secretary of State's regulatory power over poll books and other voting systems used in local elections. Ultra-conservative local officials in Shasta County unsuccessfully attempted to dump electronic voting machines last year, citing baseless concerns of voter fraud. Their arguments mimicked claims about voting machines made by former President Donald Trump following the 2020 presidential election. Well, thank you, Politico. That also mimics claims made in direct testimony yesterday in Georgia that have been made for years in direct court testimony, including in Curling v. Raffensperger, that we're going to get one of these days, and the testimony in that case, of course, by J. Alex Halderman, the cyber expert and authority on these voting machine issues. The machines are wholly incapable of producing legitimate, transparent, verifiable results, period. And they are wide open and vulnerable to manipulation. There's just no disputing that. To keep pretending these are baseless claims is insane. California is certain to support Vice President Kamala Harris in the presidential election, but there are several close congressional races in the state that could have a significant impact on the balance of power in Washington. This, of course, according to Breitbart, who I guess is objectively reporting these things, but ignores the fact that elections are just outright stolen. I talked last week about this myth of a close race. It might be a close race in California with legitimate elections. I still think Trump would win, but it might be close. The reason Kamala is expected to win big is because California has the fakest elections in the country. This is so comical, you'd have to think it's fake. The state wants to make sure that local governments can't work to guarantee the legitimacy of their own elections. They have to follow the state's plan. And of course, the same ideology is being applied on a national level. One of the first things we heard in 2021 after the fake administration assumed publicly acknowledged control was the federal government attempting to take over elections around the country, figuring out how to violate the Constitution and remove that control from the states. This is a more localized version of that. And isn't it amazing? People can discover that their elections are actually meaningless and void, totally fake and rigged, and they essentially can't do anything about it. And they can't hold anyone accountable unless they're somehow going to win an incredible number of consecutive fake elections in order to change the policy on a statewide basis. They have to knowingly run fake elections, and there's nothing they can do about it. Now, in some sense, that seems like the ultimate control for California, for any communist government. There's no hope of ever making the elections real. But that's one of those things that can boomerang quickly. Because at the local level, people are far more likely to understand that the people who have been, quote unquote, elected into office aren't actually popular and couldn't actually win and didn't actually win because no one actually voted for them. That seems like a recipe for destabilization in the long term. But of course, we're dealing with people who want to do away with elections anyway. They want the world to be governed by AI. What are you going to vote for? ChatGPT? Also today, Julian Assange appeared in front of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe to discuss his detention and conviction and the effects on human rights. Here's a clip of some of his remarks.
I was prepared to fight for that. I believe the value of these publications was such that it's okay to have that fight, and that we would prevail because we had understood what was legally possible. My naivete was believing in the law. When push comes to shove, laws are just pieces of paper, and they can be reinterpreted for political expediency. They are the rules made by the ruling class, more broadly, and if those rules don't suit what it wants to do, it reinterprets them or, hopefully, changes them, which is clearer. In the case of the United States, we angered one of the constituent powers of the United States, the intelligence sector, the security state, the secrecy state. It was powerful enough to push for a reinterpretation of the US Constitution. The US First Amendment seems pretty black and white to me. It's very short. It says the Congress shall make no law restricting speech or the press. However, that was that the U.S. Constitution, those precedents relating to it, were just reinterpreted away. And yes, perhaps ultimately, if it got into the Supreme Court of the United States, and I was still alive in that system, I might have won, depending on what the makeup was of the US Supreme Court. But in the meantime, I had lost 14 years on the house arrest, embassy, siege, and maximum security prison. So I think this is an important lesson, that when a major power faction wants to reinterpret the law, it can push to have the element of the state, in this case the US Department of Justice, do that. And it doesn't care too much about what is legal. That's something for a much later day. In the meantime, the deterrent effect that it seeks, the retributive actions that it seeks have had their effect.
Now, I dare say no one has been censored harder by the regime than Julian Assange. He has legitimately suffered for it and for exposing powerful people, or at least he was the face of that operation. In other remarks, he said, "I want to be totally clear. I'm not free today because the system worked. I'm free today after years of incarceration because I pled guilty to journalism. I pled guilty to seeking information from a source. I pled guilty to obtaining information from a source. And I pled guilty to informing the public what that information was. I did not plead guilty to anything else. I hope my testimony today can serve to highlight the weaknesses of the existing safeguards, and to help those whose cases are less visible, but who are equally vulnerable." He said that, quote, "The criminalization of news gathering activities is a threat to investigative journalism everywhere," and went on, "I was formally convicted by a foreign power for asking, for receiving, and publishing truthful information about that power while I was in Europe. The fundamental issue is simple. Journalists should not be prosecuted for doing their jobs. Journalism is not a crime. It is a pillar of a free and informed society." And there's been a lot of talk in the last week or so about the regime's direct efforts to censor all dissent. Here is the man that married into the Heinz oligarchy, the former senator, the former presidential candidate, the former Secretary of State and Special Climate Envoy, John Kerry.
And I think the dislike of and anguish over social media is just growing and growing and growing. And it's part of our problem, particularly in democracies, in terms of building consensus around any issue. It's really hard to govern today. You can't, there's no, the referees we used to have to determine what's a fact and what isn't a fact are kind of, been eviscerated to a certain degree. And people go, and that people self-select where they go for their news or for their information. And then you just get into a vicious cycle. So it's really, really hard, much harder to build consensus today than at any time in the 45, 50 years I've been involved in this. And there's a lot of discussion now about how you curb those entities in order to guarantee that you're going to have, some accountability on facts, et cetera. But look, if people go to only one source and the source they go to is sick and, has an agenda and they're putting out disinformation, our First Amendment stands as a major block to the ability to be able to just, hammer it out of existence. So what we need is to win the ground, win the right to govern by hopefully having, winning enough votes that you're free to be able to implement change. Now, obviously, there are some people in our country who are prepared to implement change in other ways, and
so
that's
you're
really
questioning
dangerous.
really if democracy can survive unregulated social media.
I think democracies are very challenged right now, and have not proven they can move fast enough or big enough to deal with the challenges that we are facing. And to me, that is part of what this race, this election is all about. Will we break the fever in the United States?
So he considers the First Amendment a block in their ability to create consensus, which is what allows them to govern. And so what they need to do is win enough votes to be able to enact change. And they know, and of course John Kerry knows, that elections are stolen. Now, as with the California example earlier, this is one of those things that suggests this dominating power of the regime. They control everything. There's no way we can contest that sort of power. They control the election system. They're going to put themselves in office. Then they're going to overturn the First Amendment, and then they'll cut off our speech. Well, first off, they were already cutting off our speech, working around the First Amendment, claiming their status as private companies despite fielding requests directly from government to censor the American people. And there were even those in the conservative establishment who claimed to be free speech warriors, to care about our Constitution, to care about the First Amendment, who were standing up for the tech companies' rights to censor MAGA because of how important Section 230 was and how important their status as private entities was. They pretended that those companies weren't operating as agents of the state and that it wasn't the government censoring the people. But of course it was, and the First Amendment didn't stop them. And it's not what's stopping them now. What's stopping them now is that they've lost the argument. Everybody can see their censorship, so they're trying to come up with more clever ways and more clever justifications, and they continue to fail at that. To censor the way they would need to take virtually everyone off of social media, and then everyone else would notice it. The product wouldn't even serve its purpose for them at that point. The next move after that would be to cut communications off completely, and who knows? We might get to that point. We might see them attempt that. It's something a lot of people have projected, a lot of people have talked about for years. A great number of Verizon customers had problems yesterday. Parts of that network going offline for hours. People were seeing SOS instead of the bars showing their connection strength. The network has come back, but there's no explanation. This has happened various times over the last year from various mobile carriers, and extended and unexplained outages do not create confidence in the mobile providers and the reliability of their services. And of course, at the same time, you have Elon Musk launching Starlink satellites all over the place. He's bringing Starlink to the devastation in western North Carolina. And apparently he's been coordinating with Donald Trump on that. We'll get to that in just a couple of minutes. But they've figured out all sorts of ways to go around the First Amendment to block people's communications, to prevent the truth from getting out on a wide range of issues. They're at the point of stifling all dissent. I don't want comms to go down, obviously, but it's not the end of the world, or at least it doesn't have to be. People can prepare for these things. I just got Starlink. I haven't set it up yet, but I used it for a bit last summer. It worked great in the middle of nowhere, in a place that never had broadband. I added a link in the show notes, by the way. I think it's a sensible thing to consider. I think it makes sense to get some survival food. I think it makes sense to get a generator. There are sensible precautions to take that are worth taking. If you're able to do it, you do it. And maybe you're able to take care of not only yourself, but the person next door. But it's strange, isn't it, to think that these regime figures, the regime in general, is not actively trying to censor the American people, or that somehow that could be justified if you say it's a private company. This was the stance of the neocon establishment toward the end of Trump's first term. They're telling you it's hard to govern because the people are no longer buying into their narratives. And to cure that, they want to censor people. They say it directly from public stages. Why would anyone go along with the idea that the government's not actively trying to censor Americans? Or when they ask the social media platforms to censor Americans, the private companies, that somehow doesn't constitute government censorship. A government shouldn't be able to even consider censorship out loud. And when it does, it's declaring its own illegitimacy. John Kerry is suggesting the people be silenced because it's becoming too hard for him and his friends, who have been there for, as he says, 40 to 50 years, to govern. It doesn't work the way they used to. They're not able to just slide everything through and cash checks. So now the people must be silenced. That is an awfully strange way to run our democracy. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was at a fundraiser for Make America Healthy Again and remarked on exactly this. In his reported comments, he said, "All of these people who I grew up with, family members, friends, John Kerry, Hillary Clinton, all people that I knew, that I assumed had the same background of assumptions and ideals that I did, they've now migrated to this corrupt merger of state and corporate power, which is the essence, is the definition of fascism." I'm not saying they're fascist. I'm saying this is a fascist model, and that's somehow gotten them into supporting. And how has that happened? We saw how it happened during COVID, when they used fear, orchestrated fear by government agencies to turn us against our own freedoms, to persuade us to relinquish our freedoms in exchange for security. He is exactly right. He is also right about the definition of fascism. Fascism is the merger of state and corporate interests. And that is exactly what we have. We have global governing bodies like the World Economic Forum that have partnerships with the most massive transnational corporations. You can go on the World Economic Forum's website and just go to the partners page and see all of their partners. And as we discussed, with the local to state issues being parallel to the state to federal government issues, our government in the United States has corporate relationships in parallel to the ones the World Economic Forum has. And it has webs of NGOs, all funded by the same people funding the global governing bodies. I'm not sure why Robert F. Kennedy Jr. declined to call John Kerry and Hillary Clinton and many of these other people fascists. They support that agenda. Do we have to wait for them to self-identify? They don't hesitate to call us fascists, and they do it so often that they end up redefining the term until it is identified with us. Now, speaking of fascists and global philanthropists, here's Bill Gates talking about how he thinks we should be censored.
We should have free speech, but if you're inciting violence, if you're causing people not to take vaccines, where are those boundaries that even the U.S. should, have rules? And then if you have rules, what is it? Is there some AI that encodes those rules? Because you have billions of activity, and, if you catch it a day later, the harm is done.
Now, he is truly one of the creepiest people on the planet. His eyes don't stop moving. He's looking all over the place as he's talking. And then he laughs. He's practically giddy thinking about an AI that will enforce all those restrictions on speech. A human won't ever have to be involved, which means that no human could ever be held accountable. The AI would do all the work, perfectly protecting the central narrative. And these things are always discussed as though they might happen in the future, but that's already been happening. That's what the algorithms on social media platforms are doing when they flag posts and apply warning labels and shadow ban and censor and ban from platforms. And considering that, it seems like he's just out there trying to pitch the country on how good that idea is, so that when people find out that's already happened, those who implemented the program can't get in trouble. Let's shift to another global philanthropist who might even be creepier than Bill Gates, George Soros. This is from CNN yesterday. Odyssey completes its final restructuring and now plans to go private. Radio network Odyssey on Monday shared that it completed its financial restructuring, successfully reducing its approximately $1.9 billion of funded debt by 80% to $350 million. Odyssey shared that it expects to become a private company. Odyssey's restructuring comes after the FCC's commissioners approved the assignment of licenses held by the radio giant to a new post-bankruptcy version of the company on September 18th, allowing the radio giant to temporarily bypass the commission's review. The radio giant had filed when it disclosed it was entering a restructuring agreement to reduce debt. In February, Bloomberg reported the Soros Fund Management picked up over $400 million of the radio company's debt, making it the largest contributor among a group of lenders looking to exchange loans for stock. Odyssey's announcement also comes months after the radio giant, they keep saying radio giant, approached the FCC in March, requesting a full foreign ownership review while also asking the commission to delay its review, an FCC spokesperson said. In its request, the radio giant, again, emphasized that it believed about 22% of a new post-bankruptcy Odyssey would be foreign-owned, requesting a review out of an abundance of caution. Worth noting that this is kind of bumping up on the same issue we heard about related to TikTok. It was determined that they could force divestment for foreign ownership by individuals or entities deemed adversarial. Per U.S. broadcast ownership rules, the FCC sets the limit on the number of radio and TV stations an entity can own. The commission is also required to review foreign investments in radio station licenses and has a 25% benchmark for such investments from foreign individuals, governments, and corporations. Foreign investors can acquire up to 100% of a U.S. broadcaster or radio station, but such requests must be similarly approved by the FCC and are not approved if the commission deems foreign ownership goes against the public interest. Notably, Soros Fund Management, which was created by the Hungarian-born U.S. investor in 1970, is a privately held investment firm chaired by the billionaire. Attacks on Soros have increased in recent years, just as anti-Semitic attacks have also risen, many of which stem from right-wing influencers who vocally champion the international strongmen Soros opposes. Now that is just magnificent. Soros, who publicly donates to Democrat candidates and liberal causes, is also the founder and major contributor of the Open Society Foundations, which aims to work for justice, democratic governance, and human rights. Soros Fund Management and Open Society Foundations did not respond to CNN's request for comment. And why would they bother? CNN is doing PR for them. They just asserted that, quote unquote, attacks on Soros are anti-Semitic and come from right-wing influencers who support the strong men around the world that Soros opposes. It's not the currency manipulations. It's not the cultural degradation. It's not the funding of all these communists. It's not the color revolutions. It's that we like Viktor Orban too much. In mid-September, the Rupert Murdoch-owned New York Post reported that the FCC had fast-tracked Soros' acquisition of radio stations that reach more than 165 million Americans, emphasizing that Soros purchased more than 200 radio stations in 40 markets just weeks before the presidential election. The story also alleged that the move by the FCC marked the first time in modern history that such a deal has been approved by the full commission without first running the national security review process. The licenses in question were transferred not to Soros, but to a post-bankruptcy Odyssey, of which Soros would be a major shareholder and not the owner, the FCC clarified. Calling this move a shortcut or a fast-track process is also false, an FCC spokesperson said, since the license transfer process is identical to one used under Ajit Pai, the former FCC chair appointed by former President Donald Trump, both in 2018 with Cumulus Media and in 2019 with iHeartMedia, as well as many others. Odyssey is the second largest radio company in the United States, behind iHeartMedia and ahead of Cumulus. So they want to make it very clear that George Soros himself is not buying these radio stations. He's not going to be operating them, so they claim. Now, is that possible? In a drainage scenario, it definitely is possible, and we'll see how this ultimately turns out. In 2022, George Soros was reported to have purchased 18 Spanish-language broadcasters. So there have been many radio plays, and if the internet were to drop out for whatever reason, and people weren't getting television news and they weren't getting their news off the internet, then the radio would be a place people immediately turned. So if we reached that point of the information war, one would expect both sides would want to have some dominance of the radio waves. The constantly infuriated militant Zionist warmonger on Fox News, Mark Levin, is rather upset about this report. On Saturday, he posted on X, formerly Twitter, breaking: FCC Soros end run around federal licensing rules to fast-track sale of Odyssey's 220 stations before the election is under investigation by the House Oversight Committee. The sale includes WPHT in Philadelphia, which just announced out of the blue that it's dropping my show in 7 days. Apparently, he's concerned about George Soros censoring conservative voices. Or perhaps he's concerned with the government helping that happen. But then you just have to tell yourself it's a private entity and the government's not censoring directly. I mean, you can't prove it. I guess Mark Levin just has to abide by the rules of the free market. And I'm saying that a bit sarcastically because these Con Inc. media figures did nothing to support the Americans who were actually censored and banned from platforms, because it turns out that despite all his screaming about tyranny and leftists, his agenda is more aligned with them than it is with making America great again. He is an Israel-first conservative. He ignores our stolen elections. He supported Ron DeSantis in the fake primary. And he believes that the paragliding go-kart incident licenses Israel to kill indiscriminately for as long as it wants everywhere. People call him the Great One for some reason, but he's a raving lunatic. It's strange that normal people adopt that phrase, the Great One, just because Sean Hannity says it. Also, does anyone know if it's anti-Semitic for Mark Levin to be upset about George Soros purchasing these stations? And isn't it kind of hard to be upset about that sort of thing when you've worked for decades for Rupert Murdoch? That's not even really a matter of political preference anymore. They both serve the same regime and the same agenda. It's just that Fox News markets to people who like the uniparty right version better than the uniparty left version. Is Mark Levin claiming that he's somehow being censored by George Soros? Is this supposed to be for street cred or something? While many of us have been censored online for the last 4 years, Mark Levin has had a TV show where he makes probably $1 million a week, like his peers in the industry do. He's already a host on a network owned by foreigners, which works out fine for him because he's a supporter of the global regime's agenda. In fact, he said this about Israel on Sunday: "None dare call it treason but me. Israel is conducting its operations despite the fact that Harris, Biden, and Blinken are withholding replacement munitions, ammunition, bombs, and other armaments already approved by Congress, while China, Russia, and North Korea are arming up Iran as fast as possible. In fact, our corrupt regime has sent more funds to Iran than Israel and has continued to lift sanctions on Iran, even though their proxies shoot at our ships and are actively trying to assassinate Donald Trump. That is treasonous. Well, aside from the Trump part, you're really only defending Israel, not American interests in any regard. And I don't know how anyone can take it for granted that Iran wants to assassinate Trump just because the TV says Iran wants to assassinate Trump. That's a narrative put out there by people who want war with Iran and or people who want Trump assassinated and want someone to blame it on. Mark Levin just said it should be considered treason not to supply Israel with all the money and weapons they want. Treason from the perspective of what country? Isn't Levin supposed to be a patriotic, conservative American? The hypocrisy of these people is astounding. But I know it's just all an operation to wake up the normies. And Levin is the great one. He's on the good side. I know. Now, we talked a bit about Starlink. Donald Trump was in Valdosta, Georgia yesterday, checking on things down there, giving a press conference, talking about the fallout of this Hurricane Helene situation, and noting that he's been in discussion with Elon Musk about providing Starlink for on-the-ground communications as he does in other war zones like Ukraine and elsewhere like Brazil. Here's Trump.
Nobody's seen anything like it, and to every family that's been displaced here in Georgia and North Carolina, which has really been hit. We were going there also, and they don't have communication. They don't have anything right now. We're trying to. I just spoke to Elon. I'm getting him. We want to get Starlink hooked up because they have no communication whatsoever. And Elon will always come through. We know that. And so we're working on that, getting them hooked up. They asked me whether or not that would be possible. We're going to try and get the Starlink in there as soon as possible because they have no communication.
So that was from Fox News. They have a little ad in the bottom right corner with a QR code so that you can donate to the Red Cross because they do such excellent work. And it's funny because in the frame, Trump is flanked by Franklin Graham, who has an organization called Samaritan's Purse that apparently does similar work. But that's quote unquote former President Donald Trump getting in touch with private citizen and business owner Elon Musk to get Starlink up and running in that part of North Carolina. Or it's just the president talking to the nation's #1 defense contractor. I mean, take your pick. It could be one or the other. Who knows? Here's CNN wrestling with that very problem.
He is being treated not just as a former president, but almost as though he is a sitting president. As Boris, you just noted, getting a briefing from FEMA, getting a briefing from the National Guard. That is not something that is typically just offered to a candidate. They are treating him as though he is a former president who is there to help. And one thing that I had noticed earlier during our 1 p.m. conversation was that Donald Trump did not have that much to offer in terms of resources since he is not a sitting president. But I will note that he and the campaign say that they have arrived in that area with trucks full of supplies that they plan on giving out. So there is something there for them to offer. He also said that he had a tanker truck full of gasoline, which obviously, if you've ever covered one of these storms, you understand that one of the first things and hardest things to come by is gasoline. So he said that he was going to be giving that out. He is clearly taking this seriously as a politician is on the ground, trying to show that he is there in support of the people on the ground in Georgia.
So you get it? He's definitely a former president, and that's why he doesn't have that many resources with him. But he does have like a fuel tanker and this other stuff. And he is having Elon bring in Starlink. And he is getting briefed by FEMA. And he is the one who's actually there leading things. And he is the one that everybody likes. And he is getting treated as though he is a sitting president, but he's not one, or else he'd have more resources. Joe Biden spent the weekend on the beach. Kamala Harris spent the weekend at fundraisers. And so the people of Western North Carolina and parts of Georgia are dealing with historic flooding. And we are supposed to understand that this occurred as the result of a very natural disaster, an extremely natural disaster. It's unfortunate that all of this happened, but it's no one's fault because we can't control the weather. Except, of course, they can kind of control the weather. I did an episode on this last summer. It's called Very Natural Disasters, talking about this pair of hurricanes that was supposed to strike in California and Florida, and it was going to feature the responses of Gavin Newsom versus Ron DeSantis, right as they led up to their debate, as Ron participated in the fake Democrat primary, and Gavin Newsom, I guess, just wanted to talk to him or market himself on television. Both hurricanes were less severe than the media anticipated. There was flooding in Los Angeles, but there's flooding in Los Angeles all the time. There's terrible drainage there. And the thing about storm drainage in cities like that is they can just close the drains. So if they wanted to cause flooding, they could cause flooding. In this North Carolina situation, in addition to any potential weather manipulation that caused this storm to be more severe, it's very odd that the storm appeared out of nowhere in a couple of days in the Gulf of Mexico, reportedly strengthening to a Category 4 as it hit Florida, but really caused the most damage hundreds of miles inland. There were concerns about the management of dams in western North Carolina and eastern Tennessee, followed by some warnings and some evacuations. But we're told the culprit for all of this is climate change. Yes, there are people who still believe in climate change and that climate change is causing all of these very natural disasters. That would be ridiculous, except they slap the word science on it, and then all of a sudden, it's the most authoritative information anyone's ever going to come by. Now, if you think it's beyond the pale to question this sort of event because it's just a natural disaster, no one was trying to make this happen, no one was trying to destroy people's lives in this way, I really do understand where you're coming from. But the thing is, if it is physically possible for this to have been affected in some way by man's behavior, if it could be on some level intentional, then you at least have to consider the possibility. We talked yesterday about how elections were changed outside of normal procedures, blamed on COVID because of an emergency declaration. Georgia and North Carolina are often considered swing states. They wouldn't be if we had legitimate elections, but we don't have legitimate elections. Did they need the emergency declarations? Were there corporate interests involved? A lot of people are talking about lithium mines in Gaston County. Gaston County is about 100 miles away from where much of the devastation is, so I'm not sure that fits just right. But what can we learn from the response? The fake president's not there. The fake vice president's not there. The event itself is being called proof of climate change and the result of climate change. You're supposed to understand that the science says correlation does imply causation. Look, America, this is what could happen to you if you don't trust the science. It's strange that they've been unable to stop climate change with all of the money and all the power that's been handed over to them. I know it's not enough. It's never enough. You can never truly solve a problem like climate change. That's why you just have to keep giving your money and power over to that global regime that you know is trying to exterminate you, and hope that maybe they'll at least ease your suffering temporarily. They will stave off that climate disaster just a little longer. Whenever a new and devastating event is used to push a political agenda priority that was already in place, you should understand immediately that they are not taking the event seriously. On some level, the event to them is not real. To the extent it is real, it's not a crisis, it's an opportunity. We've all heard the old adage about some Chinese word that means both crisis and opportunity, and that's very real in our modern politics. In fact, former Obama Chief of Staff Rahm Emanuel, who popularized the phrase that is sometimes attributed to Winston Churchill, never let a good crisis go to waste. A crisis comes along, and they immediately capitalize on that crisis as an opportunity to do something they already intended to do. And for people who take such glee in the opportunities that crises present, you really have to wonder if they're not creating the crises. Think about COVID. We were told that came from nature. Didn't come from nature. We were told that COVID was an opportunity to build back better. In fact, there was a global initiative called Build Back Better. And Klaus Schwab wrote a book called COVID-19, The Great Reset. That is making an opportunity out of a crisis. And of course, they caused that crisis. Even if we were to believe that somehow the quote-unquote virus just appeared in nature, the total dishonesty and mismanagement would still have been a man-made crisis. Without that element, it would have been impossible for the quote-unquote disease itself to cause a crisis. People weren't dying in the streets, despite the fact that we saw video of them doing exactly that in China. People weren't dying in their homes. People were dying in hospitals and medical facilities, and never because of quote-unquote COVID. Because, of course, they couldn't test for COVID. And they would just label deaths likely COVID. They employed a hospital protocol that actually caused death, and they knew it. Was that pandemic a natural disaster? Of course it wasn't. Were the fires in Lahaina a natural disaster? At what point are these events just clearly acts of war? And who's causing those acts of war? Well, let's look around and find out who doesn't care at all that they happen. Let's find out who immediately tries to take advantage of those situations. And it's not that I love to go into this territory. I don't. But we're in a period right now of being buried by crisis after crisis after crisis. There's always something new to pay attention to, something horrifying, something threatening. And just as you start to get the details on one situation, another crisis pops up. And then you have to find out what's going on there. And it's one thing after another after another. No one has the ability to pay attention to all of it, to get all of those details, if that's the way you process information. The granularity, the obsession with details makes it impossible to ever see the big picture, and that's exactly why they do it. It's so disorienting going from one thing to the next, never fully understanding anything, and then having to revert to the mainstream media because they're the only ones telling the story at all, and you're sure the story must be real, it must be important, so then you have to know about it, but no one can know about them all at that level. What you can do is look for patterns in those stories, in the narratives themselves, because the purpose of the media in the first place is to cause you to believe certain things and then act and respond in certain ways. Some of us are used to this by now, but most people aren't. And then it becomes too much and most people check out. And once you've checked out, you've decided to delegate your thinking. You're not going to do your own research, but you still have to know the right answer. So what do? You defer to the experts. And of course, most people have lost faith in the experts. Now they're just used as an explanation. No one seems to know better than the experts. We might as well just go with the experts. The experts don't know either? Well, we might as well just obey authority then, because who else is going to help us out with all these crises? I guess we better hope the AI is already governing us, because it doesn't seem like we have a president or a vice president. And I want to spend some more time, maybe on Thursday, talking about crisis after crisis, all of them seeming to be vying for the front page today. Today marks the 75-year anniversary of China's 100-year plan. Russia scored a big victory in Ukraine. The new NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte is panicking that Russia's going to win and then conquer all of Europe as if they've all been engaged in some war against Russia for the last 1,000 years as part of the Khazarian Mafia or something. And that's definitely not it. That's a conspiracy theory. Israel and Iran are telling each other they're going to attack each other or not attack each other. We had another live event of flying missiles, just like we did in April. We have the dock workers going on strike, the first domino in what could be another series of crises all on its own. We have Julian Assange finally addressing the world, and it doesn't seem like there's any leader. I mean, at least outside of Donald Trump. People like me have been called crazy for the last 4 years for saying that, but Joe Biden's pretty clearly not president now. He hasn't been president for a while, and most people have realized that. They think it's from July. But it's not like there was some announcement Joe Biden's not president anymore. Despite that, we have Kamala Harris out there pretending to be president, and no one seems to care when the exact moment occurred that Joe Biden was no longer president. If it's possible to fail to realize when someone is no longer president, is it also possible to fail to realize that they're not president in the first place? Joe Biden was asked over the weekend about Israeli strikes in Yemen, and he said, I've spoken to both sides. They got to settle the strike. I'm supporting the collective bargaining effort. I think they'll settle the strike. He was talking about the dock workers, the longshoremen. Didn't even know what question he was answering. He was asked if more troops would be sent to the Middle East, and he said no. Yesterday in the Associated Press, we have this headline. The U.S. is sending a few thousand more troops to the Middle East. to boost security. Well, that's strange. How did the president just reverse course in one day? It's like he has no control over the situation at all. No idea what's even happening. And now the standard issue villager understands that Joe Biden having no idea what's happening is probably because he's not really president. 3 years ago, when we were saying that was a conspiracy theory. People will actually work to convince themselves that something important has just changed, rather than accepting they weren't looking at reality 3 years ago. The AP said the U.S. would be sending a few thousand troops to the Middle East to bolster security and to defend Israel if necessary. Well, today, Iran supposedly launched missiles at Israel in a face-saving effort and told Israel they're not allowed to respond. It's a strange war where they tell each other where they're going to hit and when and how, and when they're simply going to stop attacking. The fake administration is sending more money over to Ukraine, I guess because they want to have the Nazis set it on fire. Burt Jones of Georgia said on X, formerly Twitter, "It's a sad state of affairs when the Biden-Harris administration will have one meeting with the president of Ukraine and send them over $175 billion in aid, when Georgians and citizens around the nation have lost everything in the aftermath of Hurricane Helene. The Biden-Harris administration has only approved an emergency declaration for 11 out of 90 counties. This news is disheartening. While the current administration fails their citizens once again, in Georgia we will support and help our neighbors. This is the Georgia way, and that's exactly how we will come out stronger than before." And of course, he tagged real Donald Trump in that post. Trump himself put out a statement on this vacuum of leadership. This is a statement from President Donald J. Trump on the Iranian terror regime's imminent attack on Israel. Statement from President Donald J. Trump. And I know, it's probably just a euphemism. The world is on fire and spiraling out of control. We have no leadership, no one running the country. We have a non-existent president in Joe Biden and a completely absent vice president, Kamala Harris, who is too busy fundraising in San Francisco, a city which she and Gavin Newsom totally destroyed, and staging fake photo ops. No one is in charge, and it's not even clear who is more confused, Biden or Kamala. Neither has any idea what is even going on. And I get it, all euphemisms. He said we have no leadership, no one running the country, a non-existent president in Joe Biden, no one is in charge, it's not even clear who is more confused, neither has any idea what's going on. But besides that, everything's normal. I mean, no one can prove that Joe Biden received 81 million real lawful American votes, or was properly certified, or properly inaugurated, or has actually been president because, of course, he's never at the White House, and they just set up fake White Houses around Washington, D.C. But I understand, I'm crazy. Joe Biden is definitely a real president. Trump is just using a bunch of euphemisms again. When I was president, Iran was in total check. They were starved for cash, fully contained, and desperate to make a deal. Kamala flooded them with American cash, and ever since, they've been exporting terror all over and unraveling the Middle East. Under, quote-unquote, President Trump, we had no war in the Middle East, no war in Europe, and harmony in Asia, no inflation, no Afghanistan catastrophe. Instead, we had peace. Now war, or the threat of war, is raging everywhere, and the two incompetents running this country are leading us to the brink of World War III. You wouldn't trust Joe or Kamala to run a lemonade stand, let alone lead the free world. It is no surprise that Iran desperately wants Kamala Harris to be president, because they know as long as she is in power, they can take advantage of America. That is why they have tried to target me. If I was in charge, October 7th never happens. Russia-Ukraine never happens. Afghanistan botched withdrawal never happens. And inflation never happens. If I win, we will have peace in the world again. If Kamala gets 4 more years, the world goes up in smoke. And that's powerful messaging. There is a vacuum of leadership in this country right now, at least publicly acknowledged leadership. And we are in an information war where the two sides are vying for the public consciousness. We're being hit with issue after issue after issue leading up to a fake election. This is like 2020 times 10. it's 20,200. But in example after example, it becomes clear that the people who use crises as opportunities are themselves directly responsible for the crises. So we will probably continue along these lines on Thursday. We'll just have to see what happens over the course of the next 2 days. The interactive live stream for paid subscribers is going to be at 6 p.m. Eastern tomorrow. And I assume that we will be talking about the debate between J.D. Vance and Tim Walz, unless it is so boring and irrelevant that it's not worth it. So we shall see. As far as this podcast is concerned, I will be back on Thursday at the same reasonable time on the same reasonable podcast network. I don't have a network. Masks and lockdowns don't work. They lied to you about a pandemic. And Joe Biden will never be president.
In my mind, that's the end game.
If you're listening for free and would like to support the show, the best way to do that is by signing up for a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can find the info stream over on Telegram at t.me/veryreasonable. The merch site is cancelcouture.com. And for all my other links, you can visit linktree.com/imyourmoderator. And I'll see you soon. Down on the range.